so much for the introduction, and thanks for sticking around to the very last talk. I'm really excited to be here and also to be talking to you about a topic that I think is so important to the work that we're doing in product management, which is all around discovery and how we are able to make time for it. So before I dive into that, I want to make sure we're all kind of on the same page on what I mean by discovery, because I feel like this is one of these terms that just gets thrown around a lot, right? And maybe there's different ideas of what this actually means. So discovery to me is all of the work that we're doing to better understand our customers, their needs, their pain points, as well as the business context that we're operating in. So the macroeconomics, the competitive landscape, and also how we're actually taking those insights and using it to shape product development. So I'm going to go ahead and make an assumption here, which is that all of us probably agree this is important. We want to do it. It's critical for ensuring that we're not missing the next big bet. It's critical for ensuring that we're solving the biggest and most impactful problem first, and that we're investing in the solutions that have the most potential. Also, that our teams are actually able to jump on to the next topic, right, as soon as they're done delivering whatever they're working on, executing on at the moment. So if we're not doing it, it's not because we don't think it's important. I will also make another assumption, which is that most of you product managers probably already have some good practices in place to collect customer feedback. So whether you're talking directly to customers as part of interviews, whether you're doing surveys, whether you're running tests, prototype testing, A/B testing, you probably have some practices in place that allow you to collect that valuable feedback. So again, if we're not doing it, it's not because we don't think it's important or that we don't know how to do it. In my experience, often the challenge is that we have calendars, right, that look something like this, where we're just totally swamped, right, with all the ceremonies that we're participating in, one-on-one meetings, stakeholder alignment meetings. And what that means is that very often we end up being very short-sighted. So we're focusing very much on kind of what is on fire, what needs to be delivered first. And what that means is that we're kind of neglecting planning for the future. So what do we do about it, right? So what I want to share with you with my talk is an approach that worked for me in one of my previous teams, with the hope that maybe I will leave you all with a little bit of inspiration, with something that maybe you can try and experiment with to see if you're also struggling with this, to see if it might help you. And before I jump into that approach, I will just tell you a little bit about the context that I was working in at the time. So at the time, I was working as a growth PM at Smava, which is a personal loan comparison platform in Germany. And as a growth PM, I was specifically responsible for the user acquisition flow. So all the steps that users needed to go through in order to be able to qualify for a loan. So if you've ever applied for a loan, or even if you haven't, maybe you can imagine, in order to qualify for a loan, you have to provide a lot of information. And it's not just any kind of information. It's information that can be very tricky, right? Very technical in some way. It's also information you probably don't have memorized, like all of your sources of debt, all of your sources of income, and exactly how much that is. So that means this is a process you probably won't go through sitting on the subway, right, on your phone. It's something you have to really give yourself time to properly be able to fill out. It's also information that's very sensitive, right? So as a website, if you're trying to collect this information, you really have to be mindful of establishing trust with your customers so they feel confident being able to give you this information. And what all of that means is that if you are trying to optimize this route, you're trying to build a better user experience for customers that are navigating this flow, right? You have to do a lot of research to understand exactly what are the challenges that customers are having as they're trying to navigate the flow, where they might be falling off. Also, what is working well, right? Because that's also important learnings. And if you're invested in trying to optimize this flow, like how I was in the case of this company, that also means that you have to do a lot of A/B testing or testing to ensure that the changes you're introducing are actually having the impact that you expect them to have. So what that means, essentially, is that you have to do a lot of discovery work, which brings me back to the point of this talk, right? How do you actually make time for it while balancing all of the execution work that you might also be doing at the same time? So how I approached it is the way that you might approach trying to create any new habit, right? Whether it's going to the gym a certain number of times a week or cooking more often at home. I simply scheduled it in. And it might sound very counterintuitive. Hey, I have a busy calendar, so I'm going to deal with that by scheduling even one more meeting. But basically, what I was doing was that I was committing to no matter what was going on with my team, no matter what was on fire, my team would spend 1 hour a week thinking about discovery. And giving the time to really reflect on some of those insights and think about how to make them actionable. To this meeting, what did we do with it? Who was there? So in this meeting, I invited my entire team, so all the developers in my team, the designer on my team, and also the stakeholders with whom my team worked closest. So in the case of this particular team, it was someone from the data science team, marketing, customer support, research, and someone from analytics. And I should add that for the actual developers, this was an optional meeting. I didn't want anyone to feel forced to come and talk about discovery topics if they didn't care about it. But I should say that in general, they really enjoyed attending. It had quite high attendance, and even though it was optional, for the most part, my development team was always there. So yeah, what did we actually do in this meeting, and how did we approach it? So how I approached discovery was that following all of the different design thinking stages. So if you've never heard of design thinking and don't know what this is, no worries. As I go through the presentation, I will explain what these different stages are about. But essentially, with the design thinking stages, right, is you start out with this empathize stage. And this stage is all about just really trying to understand your customers and their needs at a high level. Really putting yourself in your customers' shoes, right? So for these first meetings that we had, the goal here was to do just that. So I would choose a different topic and invite a different speaker who could come and give insights on that topic. If you've ever done a design sprint, this is very similar to kind of how you would approach maybe expert sessions. So for example, right, I invited someone from customer support to come and talk about what are the top 10 reasons that customers have been calling and complaining and having issues related to my product. Someone from marketing came and talked about how they use personas and what was the research that they used to develop those personas. Someone in data science, right, talked about the algorithms that they're using and the different data that is used to feed those algorithms, right? So basically, again, the goal with these very first sessions was just to understand our users, but at a high level. We also did some exercises. So for example, maybe you've heard of this exercise, right? That sometimes it's called the eat your own dog food exercise. And the idea with this exercise is that you're really putting yourself, again, in your customer's shoes. I have found a challenge that, the longer you're working on a product, right, the easier it becomes to kind of lose track of the forest and just, become concentrated on the trees, right? You lose track of the big picture. So the idea here is to remind you what a customer goes through, right, when they're landing on your website, your app, maybe for the very first time, with a very specific goal in mind, and not having all of that context that you have, right, as a product manager, the expert in that area. So the idea here is that you should use your product exactly how a customer would, ideally using the same kind of device or platform that your customers are using. If you know the majority of your customers are using mobile web, you should be using that, right? And the idea is that you go through the exact flow that the customer would go through, And you would take screenshots and document exactly all of the steps that the customers would go through in order to achieve that end goal. So imagine if you were doing this for real, right? These would be screenshots of all of those different steps. And for those different steps, you would then be highlighting what worked well, what didn't work so well, maybe you found a bug. And if you're doing this in a group, right, you would do it individually first, and then afterwards, you could come together and you could put on a shared whiteboard, right, the steps and then what everyone kind of came up with. And often, if you do this, what emerges, right, are kind of patterns, some areas that seem to be a bit more problematic, or areas where people, seem to be performing quite well. And that helps you to give a picture of just overall what is that experience. Personally, I really like doing this exercise maybe once a year, or more or less often, depending on how often you're making updates to your flow, right? But it's always really great in terms of, again, empathizing with a user who has to do this and is lacking a bit the context that you have, right, as an expert in that area. Another really good exercise for this empathize stage is if you have access to Hotjar or Mouseflow or some other tool that allows you to record anonymized sessions of your customers. You can have a watch session where you watch some of these recordings together and observe, right, how real life people are actually interacting with your product, which is often quite different from how we imagine they're interacting with our product. And that can also be a place of learning some inconsistencies or some behavior you just did not expect. So so again, going back to this discovery meeting, right? The first sessions that we had were around these different exercises or having these different speakers come and talk on various topics. And what we did was create a kind of Trello board or whiteboard where we had different columns, again, following these design thinking steps. And we would put Post-its for, in the case of the empathize stage, all of the insights that we were collecting. So this is a totally fictional example, but just to make this a little bit more concrete, imagine, right, that after the session with customer support, we learned that CS receives many calls from customers who select an incorrect insurance product, and they're asking to cancel the product or make a change to it. So, interesting insight, right? Put a sticky on the Trello board under that column. For each of these insights in this empathize column, we would then identify what might be some follow-up questions that we might have to help us distill what is the underlying user problem behind that insight. So in this case, again, maybe some follow-up questions might be why are customers making this mistake, and how many users are making this mistake. And here, it can be really helpful to think about, right, how you can leverage qualitative versus quantitative data, right? So qualitative data will help you understand why something is happening, and this might require, right, that you actually talk to customers, surveys, et cetera. Whereas quantitative data, right, so this is your analytics, is going to help you understand how big of a problem it is, how many users are impacted, right? So it can be very helpful when you're moving from transforming an insight into defining the user problem to think about how you might be able to leverage either of those approaches. And another tip, right, if you are following this approach, is to assign an owner. So for each of these questions, we assigned a person who would be the person kind of responsible for following up on these open questions, so we could actually move forward and discuss in the follow-up in the following meeting. So this was, as I said, this was quite important to ensure that it just didn't get forgotten about and we were actually able to make progress. And that meant that in the following meeting, we were able to then actually, in the following meeting, we were actually able to then transform these questions into an actual, to define an actual user problem. So perhaps we identified that the actual user problem here is something like first-time borrowers were not understanding the different pricing plans. And as we went through this exercise, we ended up with several problems, right, under this column. But thanks to the data that we were collecting, what was really nice is that we were able to start adding a prioritization and sorting the problems based on how big of a problem it was, how many customers it was affecting, the severity of the problem. And as a result of that, it made it easy then to identify what should be the first of these many problems that the designer should move forward with to actually start thinking about a possible solution. So that brings me to the ideate column here. And the work that happened in the ideate column then became very much the day-to-day work that the designer on the team picked up. So what they were actively working on in that sprint, for example. And one kind of tip here, again, if you're following this approach, was when moving a problem into the ideate space, it was really helpful to reformulate it as a how might we question. So again, to give freedom to the designer, right, to not kind of already subscribe some kind of solution to the problem, but to really help them stay focused on what is ultimately that problem we have identified that exists and that it's worth solving. So yeah, if you've never worked with these statements before, the idea is that you formulate the problem, right, with this how might we statement. So how might we make it easier for customers to make a selection that meets their needs? I won't say too much about the ideate and prototype stages because, as I mentioned, this very much was kind of picked up by the designer on the team and worked as became part of their the work they were doing in that sprint. But I will say that having this discovery meeting was really helpful in the case that the designer needed to get feedback on a prototype. Because again, right, we had all of these different experts in the meeting, so it was really helpful sometimes to be able to get their feedback on different approaches. And as a result of this process, we ended up with this really nice backlog of different concepts that we were going to then test. And again, I'm kind of just for simplicity here, just imagining that it's, one row, but imagine if you were doing this for real, right, you would end up with a lot of different ideas making it through, right, the different columns. And so when you reach this test state, you needed also a way to prioritize what is there and figure out what will actually go into A/B testing first. And how we did that was very similar to what Carol described, right, with the Reyes metrics. We used ICE, so it's very similar, so impact, confidence, and effort. Impact rate is how much of, what is that uplift that we hypothesize that this particular idea might be able to achieve, right, as well as the severity of the problem. Confidence is how sure we are that we would actually be able to obtain that uplift that we wanted. So for example, is this the third iteration of a test? We probably will have a bit more confidence than if we are testing something for the very, very first time, right? Or how much data we had to substantiate this problem that we had identified. An effort rate is kind of that t-shirt sizing by the engineering team, how much effort they believed it would be to actually implement this solution. And as a result of that, we ended up with this, all of these different ideas prioritized based on the ICE metrics. And as new ideas arrived to this column, right, we would reshuffle what was here so that always the most promising idea would be towards the top, and this would be what would get picked up first by the development team and go into testing. The other way that this meeting was actually really helpful when ideas reached the testing phase was in actually being able to reflect on the learnings from those tests. So I've talked to developers on teams who sometimes say, hey, we're working on all of this work and delivering all this work, and sometimes, I don't even really know what was the outcome, right? Like we're just told yes, release it, or no, it wasn't successful, but we don't really reflect a lot on what we learned. And if you're doing hypothesis-driven testing, right, so that all of the tests that you run actually, there's a hypothesis behind them. Even if your test fails, you should still be able to learn something from that test. And this is really important, right? Because the majority of tests, unfortunately, often fail. So it's really important that even if you're not getting that uplift you want, that test still helps inform, right? What is the work that's going to come next? So after we would finish a test, right, the analysts would discuss within this discovery meeting, what was the outcome, what did we learn, and it was also an opportunity for others in the group to give some feedback on maybe some observations that they made, and also share ideas, right, for what might make sense as a potential future iteration. So what that meant is that even though I'm describing this as a very linear process, that's actually really not the case, right? As you're moving through these different stages, the insights that you're collecting might result in post-its being added to other columns, right? So maybe a failed test might result in you saying, actually, like, let me rethink how I am understanding that user problem, or maybe that's going to inspire another idea for a future test. I should also add that within the context of SMAVA, when I talk about testing, this was A/B testing, right? But I also understand that there's a lot of other contexts where you might not be able to do A/B testing. So testing can also represent just any way that you're validating prototypes before you fully build them or fully roll them out, right? So it might be getting feedback on that prototype from a few users, for example. It might be testing something internally. There's a lot of other ways that if you just don't have the user base, for example, to do A/B testing at scale, there might be other ways that you're able to still get that feedback. The important part is that you do it so that you're able to collect those learnings and also to de-risk introducing something that might not have the impact you are thinking it's going to have. The final thing I will just share about this approach and this way of working is that what was really nice, too, of this approach is that we ended up with this great board that made it very, very easy to describe to stakeholders our thinking, right? So why does my team's roadmap look a particular way, right? Why are we prioritizing solving one problem before another? Why are we prioritizing testing one idea over another? It was very, very easy sharing this board, right, to explain the thinking and why investing in certain solutions we believed made the most sense. It was also a way to keep track of all the learnings. Because, right, if you continue, imagine if you were really filling this in, you would get very, very long columns. And it was a way of documenting, right, what the team had tried, what the team had learned. And, right, linked, of course, you would have more extensive documentation somewhere else. But again, it was a snapshot of all the work that the team had done. So yeah, that was another very helpful kind of outcome of working in this way. And yeah, I think I'm almost out of time. So I will, open up to questions. Also, this is just one approach. My hope was to, like I said, to leave you at least with some inspiration, some things that you can try to see if maybe it works for you. But likewise, if any of you have ideas or want to share something that you have tried to make time for discovery and how you have approached it, I'm also happy to hear about that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Paola. I actually have a question just to start us off while people get their questions in. And I'm curious, you mentioned that discovery is optional for your development team, but I do know that there are some instances where you basically need people to participate. So how do you create that buy-in and create that motivation to be a part of discovery within your team as well as with stakeholders?
Oh, this is a really tough question because I really think that this is a little bit impacted by the culture and the organization and just who is on your team. Like I said, in this particular team, I was really lucky that I had a team of developers that were super enthusiastic and interested in these topics. But I mean, I've also, I've chatted with developers who say, like, this isn't my job, I don't care about this, like, I just, I want to focus on building, what I'm told to build, but I don't really want to be part of these meetings, right? And I also try to be very respectful of that. I think part of, I'm trying to think about what has kind of helped in the past in contexts like this. I mean, I've had teams where usually it's never 100% of the team that is very anti-discovery. Maybe it's one or two people. So I think in these cases, really leveraging the people who are most enthusiastic, right, can be very helpful. And then bringing in the others when you really need the technical feedback. But yeah, and like I said, in my experience, making it optional has always kind of worked out in the sense that you get those who are most enthusiastic to participate, and usually you have some level of participation. It's never, zero.
Why ICE chosen over RICE? I'm curious because reach is very important for loan products.
Yeah, this is a good question. I would say that at least how we were approaching ICE, it did kind of have reach kind of baked into it, in that we thought of impact as both exactly like reach, but also that uplift. So we kind of thought of it in a combined way. We just didn't explicitly call out reach. Reach as an additional metric. But it's a good point. By having it as an additional metric, you're also giving it a higher weight. So I can also see the argument for including it.
So the clarifying question. So the actual client input reaches you via marketing only?
Sorry, could you ask that again?
Well, so the question is, does your actual client input only reach you via marketing?
You mean customer feedback? No, as I mentioned, right, we kind of collected customer feedback several different ways. So customer support was really, really important, for example, right? They were often the ones who were talking very much directly with customers, often very frustrated customers or confused customers. Also customers who had very high kind of intention, right? Because they wanted to do something and were being kept from doing that thing they wanted to accomplish. So customer support was a really important counterpart there. And as I also mentioned, right, there are other ways that we were able to collect insights through, actually observing how customers were interacting with the product, surveys, right, where they were giving feedback on, what their experience with the product was. So there's a lot of different ways outside of marketing, I would say, to get customer feedback.
Was an hour per week enough to involve all your stakeholders in the discovery, or is that an average? Did you sometimes increase the time, or did you stick to 1 hour?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So for me, the 1 hour was a minimum, right? So because the problem that I was starting out with trying to solve was like, we just didn't have time for it, or that's what it felt like, right? That there were so many things on fire that how do you ensure that you are actually making time to think about it? So for me, it was very much like a commitment. Minimum, it's going to be 1 hour. But absolutely, right, there might be times where, unfortunately, the hour just was not enough, right? Or there were some follow-up discussions that we thought were really important, or we were moving into more of like the refinement stage for a particular idea. So that happened then within the team's refinement session, for example. So yeah, I would say it was a minimum, and it kind of depended on what else was happening. But at the very least, it was just 1 hour protected to talk about these particular topics.
How do you approach the meeting when, as an organization and team, you have 10 ongoing projects?
You mean how you? Sorry, could you repeat the question?
I think this is kind of related to the question just asked. But how do you approach the meeting when, as an organization or a team, you have 10 ongoing projects?
Ongoing projects in the sense that they're in execution phase, or you mean a lot of different topics?
A lot of different topics that need discovery.
Yeah, sure. I think this is where having these 2 points at which you're adding prioritization criteria becomes very helpful, because as I mentioned before, right, ideally you would end up, for this defined column, a prioritized list of problems, and then in this test stage also prioritize lists of problems, right? So if you are really short on time and you don't have time to talk about everything, that's probably where you should start, right? Like how do you move forward that top idea, that top problem that you have defined, how do you help move that forward? And how do you help move forward if the top idea ready for testing? I would say you would start there and then move down the list.
Why not create a separate team for research instead of involving the product developers as partners for such interviewers, as the other speaker mentioned earlier?
For doing the actual interviews, that was the question?
I assume so, yeah. Why not create a separate team for research instead of involving the product developers as partners for such interviews?
Sure. So just to clarify, the developers were not doing the interviews themselves. There was a researcher who was part of this meeting as well. When I was explaining before that we had kind of assigning all those follow-up tasks, right? That's where if there was something that required some user interviews, probably it was the researcher in that case who would actually do those interviews. Maybe sometimes, right, people might volunteer. They were just curious and wanted to listen into an interview. That's also fine. But yeah, it was the researcher who actually did the follow-up interviews, not the developers. They were more participating in the discussions that we were having in that session.
And this will be the last question. How did you choose the topic for a particular product discovery session? What were the guiding principles?
The guiding principle, we definitely had this goal in mind, right? That we needed to improve the conversion rate of the funnel, right? So I used that as a starting point, and then thought, when going into like the very first meeting, for example, right? I thought, okay, what's going to help us better understand? What's going to help us to get that uplift? What are those insights that are most crucial for us to help figure out what's not working well? So that was kind of what helped. Going back to our main metric that we wanted to move.
Great. Thank you, Paola.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, everyone.